issues. There's no use hiding it, friends. We are messed up. We all have our issues, our hang-ups, our things that we try our best to keep to ourselves, to hide from the outside world, but that inevitably come spilling out through those cracks in our armor. There's no getting around it. Each of us has issues. Now it's true. Amen is right. Now it's true, some of us handle our issues better than others. Some of us are able to both recognize our own issues and to find healthy outlets for them. But if we're honest, we know that more of us refuse to face our issues in the first place, and as a result, find less healthy outlets. But friends, whether we recognize them or not, they are there. Whether we have given ourselves a hard look in the mirror or not, they are a part of us. And whether we like it or not, they affect our lives. Although we might try to run as far away from them as possible, avoiding mirrors and dodging our reflection, in our hearts we know that if we want to ever fully live, that at some point we will each have to deal with our issues. The challenge, of course, is that many people are content with never fully living. Fortunately for us, friends, we are not the first to have struggled with our issues, not by a long shot. No, human history is filled with stories of people who have been successful and have failed at overcoming their issues. Unless we think that we as a people of faith have some secret formula for avoiding having issues, for avoiding mess-uppedness, we need only crack the pages of our Bible to be set straight. We are just as messed up as anyone else, perhaps more. The good news for us, however, is that because we have this book, this treasure trove of stories of people and their issues, complete with their often unhealthy attempts to deal with them, we have some guidance for how to and how not to deal with our own. So today, on this last Sunday of July, on this 7th Sunday after Pentecost, let's be honest with one another for a moment. Let's admit it, we have issues. It's nice to admit it, isn't it? And now, having admitted it for one another, we can turn to our text with the hope of finding some guidance for how to move forward even with our issues. Today, friends, we hear the story of Jacob wrestling with his issues, literally. Let's begin with a little reminder about some of Jacob's issues. 3 weeks ago, we were introduced to Jacob. We learned that he was the second-born twin in his family, and that his name Jacob is actually a play on the Hebrew word for heel, as in he came out grabbing his brother Esau's heel. He spent his entire life doing his best to take his brother's rightful place in their family. We remember that Jacob was his mother's favorite, that he made his brother sell him his birthright for a cup of soup, and then, as if that wasn't enough, he later tricked his father into giving him the blessing that was meant for his brother. Issues. As we can imagine, this upset Esau and resulted in his threatening to kill Jacob. So, Jacob ran away from home, and while he was on his way out of town, he had a dream about a ladder, and has since attempted to turn over a new leaf with mixed success. In between the dream and now, Jacob has stayed with his uncle Laban for 20 years, during which time he has married both of his daughters, Leah and Rachel, and their 2 maids. Like we said, issues. During this time, he has had 11 sons and 1 daughter. Dang. By and large, he dealt pretty fairly with his uncle Laban, but his uncle did swindler in his relationships. Anyway, things fell apart, and Jacob was forced to get out of town and decided to make his way back home. He tried to go back home, to the place that God had told him would be his. But in order to do so, he had to go through that land where his brother Esau was now living, which presented a slight problem. See, in the last 20 years, Jacob never made amends with Esau. It might have been on his to-do list, but he never got to it. Jacob hadn't seen Esau since his father's death and had every reason to believe that Esau was still angry with him. After all, the whole reason he had gotten out of town in the first place was because he was worried about Esau's anger at him. Friends, 20 years is a long time to have bad blood lingering between family members. But as we know from experience, it is not rare. The truth is, we are really good at holding on to grudges, especially with family. We excel at hanging on to those wrongs that were done to us. Sometimes we can even hang on to them so tightly that we don't know how to be ourselves apart from that wrong that was done to us. We see our identity as wrapped up so tightly in those issues that we let it determine who we are and how we live our lives. To be clear, it's not that stepping away was necessarily the problem with Jacob. No, there are situations for which stepping away is absolutely the right choice. But even when that is the case, healing is still necessary. In the Christian faith, we believe that healing starts with forgiveness. It doesn't always mean that we forget, or even always that we can be around that person again. But it does mean that we have done the hard work to keep that experience, or issue, or relationship from determining our lives. Do you see? Forgiveness is necessary for life. Forgiveness is necessary for health, for wholeness, for fullness of life. In other words, forgiveness isn't just about the other person, it's also about us. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. So although 20 years is a long time, we might imagine that the thoughts of his brother's anger were never far from his mind during that time. But Jacob had never been one for dealing with his problems directly. So instead of sending a letter ahead when he realized he had to cross through his brother's land, instead of setting up a meeting for a moment of forgiveness, we're told that he sends gifts. Cows, camels, and goats. Oh my. He sends gifts ahead in the hope that his brother might be bribed out of his anger towards him. He recognized this too. And once he's sent them, he's faced with the hard task of having to wait for a reply. And it is in that holding pattern that we find him today. He's on his journey towards home and has everything that has become meaningful to him over the past 20 years with him. His 12 children, his 2 wives, and their 2 maids, who are also his wives, issues, and all of his worldly possessions. And he knows that in order to get home, he has to face who he had been when he left. Friends, we can move past and move on from the mistakes of our past. But that doesn't mean we won't at times be reminded of them, or that we won't continue to face the consequences And in this moment, he must realize that if he is going to move any further, he's going to need to deal with those things on his own. And so he sends his wives, his kids, and all of his worldly possessions across the river and waits on the other side for the night. And the author of Genesis says, Jacob was left alone. Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until daybreak. It was night, and he was alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. We're never told who this man was. Judeo-Christian has sometimes said this man was an angel, and that could be. Others have said that it was God, and that too could be. But perhaps, friends, this was a description of a different kind of struggle. Maybe this was a struggle with which we have some familiarity. After all, we know what it's like to struggle with ourselves. We probably all know what it's like to be in one of those dark moments of our lives, to feel like we are utterly alone and to wrestle with those darkest parts of ourselves. Sometimes it lasts a night if we're lucky, and sometimes it's much longer. But if we want to get past those issues we face in life, then we know that the struggle is inevitable. Friends, there are lots of ways to avoid the struggle, as any addict might tell us. But in the end, if we want to find our way back towards wholeness, back home, then we will eventually have to deal with them directly. But the good news is that God is present in the struggle. Friends, God is present in the struggle. In other words, Judeo-Christian has been right to say that God was in the struggle, but maybe they were confused to think that the only way God could be there is if Jacob was literally struggling with God. No, God is there and present even when we are just struggling with ourselves. And because of that, we have hope. Friends, we have hope, not that we won't have issues. No, we can't help that. We have hope that we won't be alone when we are wrestling with them. We have hope in the fact that God does not leave us alone. We're told that Jacob wrestled with this man until daybreak. And when the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket. And Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Now, some scholars think that the authors of Genesis were trying to be proper when writing this account, so they made it the hip socket that Jacob was hit on. But that the story was much more likely that he was hit in another sensitive spot close to the hip, if you catch their drift. Hello, hello. But friends, if we avoid naming that region for propriety's sake, then perhaps we miss a valuable lesson, especially for our culture. After all, we've just learned that Jacob has 4 wives and 12 children, with one more on the way. Maybe that was normal during the time, or was supposed to serve as a sign of the covenant or something. But it might also point to the fact that he was using intimacy, sexual intimacy, as a way of avoiding his issues. As we know from our own lives, this is not uncommon. We have an SA group that meets in our church on a weekly basis because we recognize that while sex is a beautiful and wonderful gift from God, it can also be abused. Too often people use it as a means of gaining intimacy, whether through physical relationships or pornography. They use it to fill a void in their lives, but when that is the aim, you can't help but leave one empty. In other words, maybe Jacob got hit where it counts as a way of saying to him, Jacob, you've done what you can to be fruitful and multiply. You've achieved success in your childbearing adventures, and yet you are still struggling. Maybe now it's time to actually face the issues that are in front of you. Or it could be the hip side. But after this, Jacob has no more children, save Benjamin, who is already conceived. Either way, when the man says, "Let me go, for the day is breaking," we can hear it as a sign of hope. The man is saying to Jacob, you can do this. The dawn is about to break in your new life. But first, you have to learn to let go of this baggage, these issues which you are avoiding. But Jacob says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. Throughout his life, Jacob has been obsessed with receiving a blessing. Perhaps an expression of his own insecurity. And here we see him begging for a blessing from this entire mess before he can let it go. Perhaps he recognized that if these struggles he had been through were not going to have been in vain, then he had to find some blessing in them. And like us, he knows that sometimes it is easier said than done. But with any luck, we might be able to find some blessing from all of our issues. The man says, what is your name? To which he responds, Jacob. And the man says, you shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. You shall no longer be identified by your heel-grabbing ways, but by how you are dealing with your issues. You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and prevailed. Friends, Israel means one who has striven with God. The man is saying you have taken your time to really wrestle with these issues, and though you might not have them all worked out, you at least know they are there and are going into the future with open eyes. And friends, because of that, dawn is possible. Ralph Waldo Emerson said that it's only in the darkest night that we can actually see the brightest stars. In other words, it sometimes takes getting to that moment of hopelessness, to that low in our life, before we can look up and see the light in front of us. Sometimes that means wrestling with God, and sometimes it means wrestling with ourselves, but it is worth the time. Because on the other side of our struggle is life. Friends, Jacob was the one renamed Israel, but it is all of our promise. We are the people Israel because we are the ones who strive with God and with each other. Do we do it perfectly? No. Like the ones who came before us, we have our issues. But we at least recognize that in order to live how God has called us in this world, we have to wrestle with them. Our story ends when Jacob asks this man his name. But the man doesn't respond. He simply blesses Jacob. Perhaps this reminds us that at some point we have to acknowledge that we often won't get the response that we're looking for, but that doesn't mean we don't get a response at all. Jacob walked away calling that place Peniel, meaning the face of God. And when the sun arose, we are told he walked away with a limp because of his hip. Friends, we might not be able to avoid the repercussions of dealing with our issues. But in the end, we know that they will be a heck of a lot less than if we fail to deal with them at all. When Jacob leaves this place in the verses following, he's greeted by his brother with open arms and is able to go home again in peace. You see, the hope of this story for us is that although the struggle with our issues might be difficult, on the other side is that ultimate blessing of life. Friends, life is on the other side of our struggles. Or said another way, the hope of our faith is that by the grace of God,